What makes Mexican food in the US so good? Story 1. It's 3 things we have Mexicans. You guys don't. Our spices, cheeses, and even produce are different. Simple things like using different varieties of tomatoes make a big difference. Brits tend to just sort of infer what Mexican should taste like and go from there. A lot of the Mexican I had in the UK had seemingly random things added because Brits felt it was close enough for probably Mexican. Story 2. Well, 2 big things I've noticed as an American in the UK. First, the cheese. In the US you can get a massive variety of Mexican cheeses at almost any grocery store, even ones far from the Mexican border. Here in the UK I often have to use cheddar, which is a great cheese, just not for Mexican food. Second, I think the tomatoes here are more of the Italian varieties, which are great and delicious in Italian food, but I don't think they're ideal for Mexican cooking, maybe different acidities or something, I don't know. Most of the time I can work with them. Lots of cumin and cilantro, sorry, coriander, work wonders, but every now and again I'll get some that just strike a really discordant note in my dish. Story 3. It's a cycle. We have people who know how to actually cook it and access common ingredients easier and cheaper than in the UK. This makes our food better, meaning the market is more competitive. The competitive market means you have to be good to survive. Since you have to be good to survive, the food is better. Since the food is better, the market is more competitive, and so on and so forth. Story 4. I moved from the US to the UK, and even in London, I've struggled to find even the most basic Mexican ingredients. It sometimes takes visiting 3 or 4 supermarkets just to find a jalapeno. Story 5. It's the authenticity. If I want Mexican food, I look for a place where the entire cooking staff is Mexican or my kitchen. I've never been to the UK though. It also may be the types of spices used, the freshness of the ingredients, the cooking techniques. Story 6. I've never had UK Mexican food, but if it's anything like the other food they fail to replicate, it's because they don't add the right spices. You need cumin also. Fresh lime juice is a game changer. Should be using it to finish your Mexican dishes. I also only use margarita salt in my Mexican dishes. I have a pot of burrito on our end, so we'll add the spices that went into that chipotle chilies in adobe sauce, guajillo chilies, ancho chilies, smoked paprika, fresh onion and garlic, cumin, chili powder, cayenne, bay leaves, Mexican oregano, margarita salt, ground clove, chicken stock. We'll finish with spritz of fresh lime juice right before serving. Some people add cinnamon, nutmeg or cocoa to their Mexican food dishes. It's not to my taste, but it is technically more authentic. Story 7. I happened to read a recipe blog recently where the author had moved to the UK and was complaining about how they can't find masa there and have to have it imported. Masa is nixtamalized cornmeal, that is, cornmeal that's been soaked in an alkaline solution, and is the main ingredient of corn tortillas among other things. So I'm going to say that availability of ingredients is probably an issue. Story 8. I think food in the UK tends to be a bit toned down, if you will. I know it's true of Indian food. The other thing is that it's likely the person cooking your Mexican food is not Mexican. Story 9. First of all, the ingredients. A lot of ingredients aren't easy to find elsewhere. This goes for cheeses. Cheddar is going to give you the wrong taste compared to cottage de queso fresco egg. Tortilla is pretty hard to find a bakery selling fresh tortillas elsewhere, and most of all peppers, you can find some dried ground seasonings. But to cook Mexican food you really need access to the peppers themselves, guajillo, ancho, arbol, chipotle, and the like. There's just no substitute for the flavors. Some ground seasonings will include these and some Mexican seasonings are just way off base, but to get the sauces, marinades, etc. where they need to be, you really need the whole pepper. As far as veggies go, onions and cilantro are available in most places, but I'm not sure about tomatillos. Next, cooking technique and knowledge. Mexican cooking can be fairly labor-intensive, and home cooks even in the US will take the easy way out. Lots of pretty specific ways to cook meat. Steak. Chicken. Taco meat is usually finely diced and grilled at high heat. Birria is stewed for a long time. Cochinita pibil uses a specific marinade. Tinga de pollo also has a pretty in-depth seasoning method for shredded chicken. Most sauces will require you to hydrotep your dried peppers. If you haven't had the real thing to know what you're looking for, then you might not land on using these techniques. Story 10. Well, for starters, half this country used to be Mexico. Moreover, Texas, California, and the land in between have their own 3 distinct versions of that Mexican food that's influenced by other cuisine around it. Tex-Mex, Cali-Mex, and Southwestern aka Mesa-Mex are all different from Mexican food. Story 11. Mexican food is to the US what Indian food is to the UK. By this, I mean there are generations of Mexican Indian communities in every town who have made their living serving and adapting their home country's cuisine to American British tastes, to the point that it has almost become an inseparable part of the food culture. You have tiki masala, we have fajitas. Story 12. The most simple answer to why the UK doesn't have lots of good Mexican food is that we have very little Mexican immigration in the UK, not even compared to the US, I mean in general. Until fairly recently Mexican food was a novelty and you would have been lucky to find anyone attempting to make it even slightly authentically. You'd be stuck with old El Paso packet spices, or your town might have a Mexican restaurant where one of the flavors they rely on is sweet chili sauce. I did one terrible shift in a local place's kitchen as a favor to a friend. I swore to never eat there after that, for various reasons. There's also a few ingredients that we can't get with any reliable quality. This is entirely a logistics issue. We can get anything we want, but in some cases it simply won't be as fresh, or won't be ripe, or any number of other issues caused by being a temperate island that's quite far north of the equator. For example, I have never seen an actually ripe pineapple in real life. I know what they're supposed to look like. I've seen some that have sat in a supermarket long enough that the chlorophyll has started to break down and turn the green into a kind of yellow across some of the fruit, but once a pineapple comes off the stalk, it's never going to actually become ripe, regardless of the tricks that people talk about. It ripens from the stalk. Anything else is just slow decay. I digress, but we're not getting the best versions of the necessary ingredients on our little island, and we're lacking in people with the generational knowledge of how to get the best out of the ingredients we do have. I've heard London has some really good places now, but that's as far as it's gone, and maybe as far as it will, outside of maybe Manchester. I doubt my northern hometown is getting authentic Mexican food anytime in the next 5 years, say. Story 13. Honestly, it's probably the immigrants from Mexico who makes Mexican food so good. We have our own version of it, which is Taco Bell, of course, and I know a few Mexicans myself who likes to go there. Story 14. This may be a hot take. I think the proximity to Mexico helps, not just because Mexicans are making the food, but also because Mexicans are eating it. Let me explain. In the US, you can open an authentic Mexican restaurant and have a steady stream of Mexican customers that appreciate the authentic flavor profile and will support the business, providing a solid customer base, especially a few decades ago when Mexican food may have been less familiar. You also have non-Mexican customers who enjoy the taste and over time become a larger portion of the customer base as well. In the UK, you need to create a cuisine that caters to a British palate off the bat. In today's world, it's easier than ever to get a recipe and make Mexican food. However, it's entirely possible that customers complained that it's too spicy, etc., and the food needed to be toned down, resulting in the watered-down version of the food today. This is also my pet theory on why Tex-Mex is hard to find in NYC. A lot of people can make it, but not as many New Yorkers actually want that kind of Mexican food to support it. Story 15. Well, we have more Mexicans in the USA than the UK does, so what knowledge UK is getting about Mexican is third-hand. Also, the type of spices we have access to, that the UK may not have, probably makes a difference. Story 16. We live in California, and whenever we go to the UK to see family, they always ask if we'll cook Mexican for one dinner. It's hard to get the right ingredients sometimes, and it can end up what we call here white people taco night, but when I went to Borough Market I could find almost everything I needed for a more authentic meal. Story 17. I think one underrated ingredient in Mexican food is lime. It cuts through the fattier meats and cheeses if included, and pairs really well with spicier flavors. I had Mexican food in Australia, not Guzman y Gomez, and my takeaway was that it tasted like someone put a cheeseburger in a flour tortilla. There are a lot of little things that make it stand out. Story 18. My brother-in-law from Poland came to visit a few years ago, went out to Mexican. He was like, of course we have Mexican in Poland, tacos and chimichangas. Then he saw the menu and his head exploded. He didn't realize how much variety there really was. He ordered something the size of a small dog, ate the whole thing, and proclaimed it the greatest meal he ever ate. Story 19. I'm from San Diego, married to a Mexican and pretty particular about our Mexican food. We have it at least twice a week. We were on a trip in Central Europe and really craving home. We met a Mexican traveler from LA who recommended a Mexican restaurant in Old Town Prague. He was like, "You're not going to believe this, but it's legit." Sure enough, it was really great. Tasted very much like home. Turns out the chef co-owner is an expat from Calexico, a small border town about an hour and a half from SD. She uses family recipes and imports as many ingredients she can from the US and Mexico, dried chilies being one. She makes her own tortillas too, which made a huge difference. Her salsas were on point too, fantastic margaritas. So it's possible to have good Mexican food overseas if you know what you're doing. FYI, when we travel in Europe we usually check out the locals' version of Mexican food just for fun. So Prague definitely had the best. The worst we had was in Edinburgh. It was highly rated and not terrible, but it wasn't anything close to home. Very bland, no depth of flavor. Story 20. Honestly, my only knowledge of Mexican food in the UK is that cursed episode of Bake Off. People on here are talking a lot about the tomatoes and cumin and dried peppers. But I think the onion makes the biggest difference. My culinary experiences in Northern Europe were dominated by sweet and yellow onions. Using white onion makes a world of difference in Mexican food. That, as well as fresh cilantro and jalapeno, will cover for all sorts of different tomatoes. If you've got white onion, fresh jalapeno or serrano, fresh cilantro, tomatoes, lime, a piece of beef, and a reasonably decent tortilla, you can easily make a passable taco. Having crema mexicana, queso fresco, avocado, salsa verde, etc. dresses it up nicely, but IMO isn't a requirement. Story 21. It's the differences in the culture's tolerance for flavor. Mexican food has a lot of spices and peppers and heat. Americans enjoy that, but somewhat toned down a little bit. The UK has a reputation for people saying that black pepper sprinkled lightly on white chicken breast is too spicy. You can't get that good Mexican flavor without the actual Mexican seasoning and spices. That means you have to go a little bit hotter than salt and pepper. Story 22. We have a ton of Mexican immigrants bringing their cuisine to the US. We have lots of Americans who have vacationed in Mexico and enjoyed the food there, so there's a lot of demand for good Mexican food, knowledge of how to prepare it, demand for ingredients both via import and domestic manufacturing. As an example, many might not think of Chicago up north. in the Midwest is a hotbed of Mexican food, yet the city's population is about 13 Latino, and mostly Mexican immigrants or ancestry. So we not only have lots of Mexican food, but even restaurants focusing on regional specialties like Oaxacan, Jalisco-style birria stewed goat or beef, Nayarit-style seafood, etc. We have everything from little old ladies selling tamales out of coolers on card tables and mom-pop taquerias, to Michelin-star fine dining Mexican cuisine. I believe Chicago has the most commercial tortillerias of any city in the U.S. We have plentiful access to fresh daily tortillas in most grocery stores, delivered by the 5 to 6 big tortilla makers. If you dig into the boxes, you can still get the tortillas warm from the factory. As for well-known chefs, the best-known Mexican cuisine chef is probably Rick Bayless. Ironic that he's not himself Mexican, but fell in love with the cuisine living in Mexico as an anthropology PhD candidate. Switches to cooking and brought his love of Mexican food to the U.S., has his long-running show on PBS, and has an empire of restaurants here in Chicago, including that Michelin-starred spot I mentioned, Topolobampo. Story 23. As an American who's been to the UK a handful of times, hey race, what I figured out. You don't have the correct ingredients available cheaply, wrong cheese, wrong corn flour not masa, almost no access to proper dry chile, so what happens is, the cheap UK Mexican restaurants are incredibly bland. The expensive ones that have access to the ingredients feel like they have make a big OL show of even the basic Mexican dishes, or worse yet is they have to add their own signature flair to them. Story 24. To me it's almost like the ingredients all came from a can or jar, the sauce is more like ketchup with some little chunks in it than real salsa or red sauce, the meat doesn't have enough cumin in it, the cheese is not authentic but just cheddar, while real Mexican should be more Monterey Jack cheese and maybe a little cheddar. I don't understand it. If you actually follow an authentic recipe and use the right ingredients, it should come out okay. Someone mentioned the tomatoes in Europe are different than the ones in the SC, this is true, plus I think a lot of recipes call for tomatillos which are a bit different. Story 25. I mean, the UK is extremely far from Mexico and removed from its culture. Some people get mad about this, but the presence of Mexican culture is in many ways innate to U.S. culture. That being said, I recommend you visit Mexico City, solid contender for greatest city on earth in my opinion, and have the Mexican food there because I don't think you'd be called America's Mexican food good anymore. Story 26. I'm going to agree that access to the right ingredients is the issue. In a Mexican grocery in the US, you're going to find 15 to 20 varieties of dried chilies, and that's just the chilies. I have an American friend who married a Brit and moved to London, and she posts photos of Mexican food from the UK on Facebook for her American friends to laugh at. Judging from those, another part of the problem is a misunderstanding of what the flavor balance is supposed to be. Brits are a lot more familiar with Indian food, and I find myself wondering if that's part of the problem. I've seen London pico de gallo that looked way too much like onion chutney. Story 27. I'm a Texan, but lived in England, and let me tell you the difference properly using spices, having all the necessary ingredients, having actual Mexicans around. The food I had there just tasted bland in comparison to Tex-Mex Mexican food. Story 28. Proximity to Mexico for one, but also, y'all are scared to season your food. 12 teaspoons of cumin doesn't mean 12 teaspoons of cumin. Someone asked a chef how much cumin he adds and he said I dunno, maybe half a teaspoon. It really means grab your cumin and add cumin until it feels right. Same with chili powder, coriander, pepper, etc. European food is designed to showcase a cut of meat or a fresh vegetable picked at the peak of its ripeness. Spices are meant to enhance the natural flavors of those. Not so with Mexican. It's designed for the spices to be the star of the show, the meat and the vegetables are just a vehicle for them. It's impossible to overdo it. More spice will just make it flavorful. Story 29. See if you can find the cooking show Patty's Mexican Table anywhere online so you can see the ingredients and methods to really good Mexican cooking. It includes lots of fresh spices and different varieties of chilies that are indigenous to the Americas. The variety of fresh and dried chilies, thousands of varieties, and the cheese and masa make a huge difference. Also, if you're on TikTok, I dare you to search the term barbacoa recipe. You'll see lots of different ways to prepare barbacoa, but the singular virtue will be the preparation method, and how many different types of chilies you use. Story 30. 2025 people will try to be politically correct and say anyone can make great Mexican food, but I've seen Rachel Ray and Gordon Ramsay try to make Mexican food, and it's a disaster. The answer is because of Mexicans. I can say this because I'm Mexican-American. Story 31. A basic understanding of what Mexican cuisine is. Many years ago my husband and I went to a Mexican restaurant in Hull. Don't judge. The restaurant itself was lovely and the staff were friendly, but internment was flat bread almost like a naan. I mean it was good, but that wasn't even something close to Mexican food. Ordered a chimichanga and it had been made with a condiment. When I asked, the waiter said it was Mexican ketchup. I told him there is no such thing. One does not add a condiment to a chimichanga. They had also used very Indian spices in the food, not Mexican spices, so nothing tasted right. One can't just substitute spice A for spice B and expect first work. We were in Tesco once and we were going down the cheese aisle and there was a package of Mexican cheese. This was just cheddar cheese with peppers in it. That's not Mexican in any way, shape or form. There's a place in Spro that my husband refuses to even let me know the name of. He said it's just not up to the very lowest bar of what we'd consider decent Mexican food. An example he gave was that the carnitas were served wet, carnitas are not served as if coming out of water. My husband and I agree that it feels as if people who have Mexican restaurants have this vague idea of what Mexican food is and have just decided to open a Mexican restaurant without having actually been to Mexico or even cracked open a cookbook of traditional foods and cooking practices. Story 32. It is definitely the Mexicans or Salvadorians or Puerto Ricans. Our nation is a true melting pot. I live near a Thai place, a pho place, a Mexican place, an Indian place, and a Popeye sits the people that make America great. Story 33. I've moved from a tiny West Texas town in the middle of nowhere to the Pacific Northwest. The Mexican food is not even from the same planet. In the PNW, it has a closer resemblance to tomato soup and a grilled cheese sandwich than it does to Mexican food. Story 34. So of course there's ingredients and Mexicans who know what it should taste like. But there's also respect for the food culture. For instance, it's so much better to char your chiles and then steam than in a bag, such a better depth of flavor than canned. And if you're doing a kind of cuisine, say sofrito from certain places, you'll need specialty chiles like ajo dulce, or even just cilantro, and tortillas. We have restaurants that want tortillas so good they make them themselves. Fresh tortillas with beans from the olla and a little cheese is a perfect meal. Sure, you can sub in store-bought tortillas, and old Anaheims, and canned refritos, but it's not the same. The good ingredients must be treated with good traditional respect. People here will do their best to really get the right things and treat them correctly. Story 35. Proximity to Mexico. There are 3 huge Mexican groceries in my city. The ingredients make the meal, with a bonus if it is made by actual Mexicans. I am a dual national USCU, and what I have noticed is that in Europe, the Mexican food looks like Mexican food, and is quite tasty, but it does not taste like Mexican food. Story 36. I live in Texas, which was recently by European standards part of Mexico. Mexican food varies by region, and Tex-Mex is just another region to me. I grew up on it and still think it's the best. Story 37. Coming from a Canadian LOL. If you think Mexican food in the US tastes good, you should really try Mexican food in Mexico. As far as the US goes, not all of the US has great Mexican food. I have traveled around the US and Mexico quite a bit, and can say a lot of states have worse Mexican food than up in Canada. While other US states like California, Arizona, New Mexico are awesome, I will admit, while Mexican food in Mexico is always at a very high standard, the best Mexican I have ever had was in San Diego, about 5 miles from the Mexican border. Once you get more southeast, then the food starts switching to more Tex-Mex, which I love as well. But not exactly 100 Mexican. More northern states it's kind of hit and miss on how good the Mexican food is. As you can see, I am a bit of a Mexican food addict, as the El Paso commercial says you don't want salsa made in New York City. Story 38. Dude, I live in California and make good Mexican food, but even I can't match an authentic Mexican restaurant. The best Mexican food in the US is in the border states. The best food in the border states are small mom and pop restaurants in poor neighborhoods where Mexican immigrants eat. If you get a peek inside the kitchen, you will notice cans of lard. So yeah, it's spices, but it's also lard, the type of cheese, and an old abuela who makes the tortillas by hand. If you ever come to the States, you'll see what I mean. Story 39. I only have a very narrow frame of reference, but my personal experience has taught me that Mexican food in the UK is not good, and I have sworn never to eat Mexican food in England again. Admittedly, it was only one meal I had over there, but it was so bad that I have no qualms in condemning a whole country over it. Story 40. The only place I've eaten Mexican food in Europe was Germany, so I can't comment on the UK, but the German examples I tried were simply awful. The biggest problem was the lack of seasoning and marinades. The tacos I ate were just plain ground beef and onions, with maybe a little salt and pepper, and dressed with a cheese that just wasn't right for the purpose. I don't particularly like spicy hot food, but at least a little cumin, cilantro, cayenne and jalapeno would have gone a long way to help. I've had Thai, Malaysian and Indian food in Germany that de-emphasized capsaicin-based spice for the German palate but was still pretty good. I'm not sure why replicating decent Mexican food in the country is so difficult. Story 41. Give me a recipe and I'll tell you how to fix it. I've lived in Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Southern California, and Florida, Cuban and Puerto Rican most of my life. I married into a large California Mexican family, and my kids won't eat most of my gross white people food, so I've learned to make quite a few things. Mexican food is like British dialects, tons of regional variation, lots of snobbery, endless debates over what's proper, and everyone's favorites come from the poorest people. Even just between Dallas and Fort Worth, there's a distinct difference. Story 42. Quick guess: we have authentic Mexicans. Also, in Germany the Mexican food is, my German boss used to love going to get Mexican food here in the USA, along with good American barbecue. Story 43. Dirty little secret. Much of the Mexican restaurant food in the US is sourced from large distributors like Cisco. If you're talking about authentic Mexican food from places like Zacatecas or Monterrey, it's going to be much more expensive and delicious. Story 44. Are there any well-known Mexican chefs in the US you can recommend? Find an abuela, and become friends. My neighbors are from Mexico City, they can cook. Story 45. The Mexican food I've had in the UK is an abomination. It's the wrong ingredients prepared the wrong way by people who've never eaten actual Mexican food before. At best, it's a Spanish-inspired knockoff of what Brits think Mexican food might taste like. My husband was offered a job in the UK a few years back, so we went and explored the living conditions there. I remember walking through grocery stores in London and noticing that they didn't even have the ingredients to make Mexican food. We concluded that we would need our family back in Arizona to ship us masa, peppers, spices, etc. if we wanted to eat Mexican there. Story 46. It's cooked by Mexicans. Back in the 80s and 90s, if you went to a Mexican restaurant, you would not see a single Mexican person working there, and the food wasn't that good. Chicais comes to mind. Story 47. Not or if this is said elsewhere here, but I think it's a lot like Indian food in the UK. Critical mass of immigrant population ultimately gives rise to netter ingredients and better overall product. I've had some excellent Indian food in the US, but the bar is just higher in the UK. You won't survive long if you offer a mediocre product compared to the competition, in either market, for the respective cuisine. Story 48. If you're only hearing this from Americans, it just means they prefer what they're used to and the restaurants they eat at in America are serving what customers have come to expect. If you hear this from someone who's actually Mexican, I'd be surprised. Story 49. I have had Mexican food in the UK. It is equivalent to the Mexican food I've had at mediocre Mexican restaurants in the East Coast Mid-Atlantic region. Now, I am from San Antonio, Texas, a city that is comprised 60% by Mexicans or people from other Latin South American countries. I will put our Mexican food up against any in the world. It's incredible. Yes, a lot of it is Tex-Mex or Jalisco-style food, but I can get delicacies from across the spectrum of Mexican food. I think it's best here because of access to Mexican ingredients and spices, combined with the people who know how to make it. Plus, we have an audience here that will not tolerate mediocre Mexican food. So any restaurant that tries to serve store-bought manufactured tortillas instead of homemade probably won't make it very long. Story 50. What a weird question. This is like asking why French food is better in Quebec than India, or like asking why seafood is better on the coast than inland. Like duh, for one, because Mexican Latin people are from here, I doubt there are almost any Mexican Latin people in the UK. I'm sure there are a few but no population of significance, and if there is, it is extremely recent, so the Mexican food there is a rough interpretation that has degraded the further it gets from the source. Yes, I am sure there are a few exceptions somewhere. For another, the primary ingredients used in Mexican Latin food are native to the Americas. Corn, tomatoes, beans, hot peppers, cacti, and probably other stuff that is commonly used in Latin food literally did not exist outside of the Americas until colonization. So learning and perfecting their use for hundreds of generations, specifically nixtamalization, has such a long cultural knowledge in this continent that it makes sense that we are just better at doing it. Story 51. The last time I was in London, I went to a Mexican restaurant near Covent Garden called Café Pacifico. It's still there. It certainly looked the part of a Mexican restaurant, but the street tacos plate came with a lamb taco. No substitutions were allowed. The aforementioned street tacos plate came with a large bowl of refried beans. The street tacos were also festooned with large chunks of raw onions. The seafood enchilada used cod. The salsa seemed to come out of a jar. It tasted like paste. At least it wasn't made in New York City. Of course, I understand that a Mexican restaurant in England is going to use locally available protein options and cater to British tastes, which lean in the lamb and cod direction, but it doesn't make for good Mexican food. Story 52. Rick Bayless out of Chi-Town, Chicago. Been following him for over 10 years. Great authentic Mexican cooking. He travels there often all over the different states of Mexico for regional ingredients, foods. As for the taste, well, we have access even here in NYC to all their products. I've been in UK grocery stores. The variety is quite sad, but I imagine like NYC you have small neighborhoods where you can get specific stuff from certain countries, cultures. Story 53. I think it's entirely proximity to Mexico and all the Mexicans living here. Traveling around the US, you'll see Mexican food gets noticeably better the closer you get to the border. The best Mexican food is in border states like Texas and California. It's hard to explain why exactly it's better specifically, since to me it just tastes better. They pay attention to little details more, like you go to a taco stand in Texas and they'll probably have fixings like roasted jalapenos and multiple kick salsas. You go to a taco place in Ohio and they won't pay attention to details like that. Their sauces will be blander. Their ingredients won't be as fresh. Story 54. I had really great Mexican food in Prague a couple years ago. Looked up the chef and sure enough they were from Southern California. They imported a lot of their ingredients because it's just not the same if it's not from Mexico, and it does make all the difference. Story 55. I've had UK versions of Mexican food before. Y'all aren't using the right ingredients. Like at all, for example, in the UK I've seen Spanish chorizo used in lieu of Mexican chorizo, which is just wrong. It's like substituting a salami for a bratwurst because they're both sausages. Story 56. It's the inverse of why Indian food is better in the UK than in the US, at least based on my experiences. Just a closer cultural proximity to the way things are done. There's a lot of technique that goes into good food, and it's not universal, e.g., roasting spices isn't the same as roasting chilies. Story 57. While yeah, the Mexicans is a pretty obvious and simple answer, but I'm going to buck the trend and say a lard and be toasting your spices whole, and then grind. Your regular hole-in-the-wall places that manage to stay open in all the little villages and ghost towns generally do so thanks to blue-collar workers stopping for 20 minutes between power poles or plumbing jobs. So you can slam down 2,000 calories in one plate, then the cold doesn't so bad and a good cold soda and some salty food makes the heat less. Story 58. Most people have already answered the question, but I just wanted to share some anecdotes. First, like 10 years ago my friend went to Cambridge for a summer study abroad session, and there was this taco truck that his classmates, mostly all non-American, were raving about and said tasted amazing. When he finally went, he said it tasted like Taco Bell. Now, Taco Bell isn't bad, but it definitely wasn't what he was expecting and he was very disappointed with the food. I had a similar experience in Paris, except this time, some Americans not from border states had recommended this one restaurant that was supposedly authentic. I was also studying abroad from California, and had been craving a burrito for months at that point. I went during lunch hour. It was empty. I'm pretty sure the waiter, who I think also made the burrito, didn't speak Spanish, and it was one of the worst burritos I've had in my life. I had a similar experience in Finland with this one chain whose name I forgot, but people had likened it to Chipotle, and I really think that they had been in Finland so long that they forgot what Chipotle tastes like. Story 59. I would assume that most of the Mexican food served in the UK is Tex-Mex rather than authentic Mexican. Hard-shell tacos, seasoned ground beef filling, etc. I like Tex-Mex, but authentic Mexican done well is a different cuisine and much better. Authentic Mexican is a highly complex and varied cuisine, with exotic ingredients that are probably hard to source in the UK. Story 60. As an American that lived in the UK, it was shocking to me just how low-quality Mexican in the UK was. I tried at least 5 to 10 different restaurants across London, Bristol, etc., and always left horrified. Honestly, it's just completely off base. They do everything in a weird way. With that said, from the perspective of an American, you should realize there are different types of Mexican, authentic Mexican. This would be either in Mexico, or in Los Angeles, Southern California, where there are tons of Mexican immigrants. Tex-Mex. This is Americanized, usually having queso, heavy quesadillas, etc. Other regional Mexican varieties, like New Mexican, Colorado, UK, really doesn't get any of the 3 correct at all. Story 61. My guess would be it's difficult to bring authentic ingredients, and when your customer base is British, you may cut a few corners to stock what you need, similar to how we can't have good New Orleans food in Denver, Colorado, 1,100 miles away. Story 62. The UK, and if I'm being honest, the entire NE of the US has an authenticity issue when it comes to Mexican food. Authenticity is important for a lot of reasons, but for the consumer it directly affects taste. Every cuisine has established over time and a whole lot of work what flavors and textures work together. When chefs lack that knowledge, they substitute ingredients and modify recipes in completely inappropriate ways. Don't get me wrong, all chefs cooking a cuisine that is not the local one are going to need to make substitutions both for availability of ingredients and the local taste preferences. If you have a solid understanding of the cuisine, this can be great. On the other hand, if you don't understand the original, you end up serving things like blackberry and goat cheese guacamole. Story 63. Okay, you're asking specifically what ingredients we use. I don't know what you use in the UK, but there are a few general rules in my opinion, and I am not Mexican, so take this with a pinch of cumin, cilantro, lime, fresh onion. Spices made of dry chili peppers, cayenne and chipotle are the best, more garlic than you think you need. The correct type of cheese, queso fresco, Monterey Jack, queso blanco. If you use American cheese or cheddar cheese, or any other non-Hispanic cheese, you're gonna have a bad time. Avoid any sweet flavors when you are marinating the meat. Story 64. We are so lucky. The Twin Cities has a huge Hispanic population. With 5 miles I've got a dozen mercados and 2 dozen excellent authentic restaurants. Not just Mexican either, Guatemalan, Peruvian, Ecuadorian, Cuban and Dominican. Story 65. It's largely the knowledge of cooking styles and the availability of ingredients. I'm a Canadian that spends a lot of time in Mexico and an avid cook. Off the top of my head, here are the ingredients that are important but tougher to find. Achiote annatto seed paste. Used usually in combination with citrus like orange juice as the base for a great many marinades and cooking sauces. It's what often imparts Mexican grilled or roasted chicken with a red color. Also used in moles and adobo. Epazote green herb that imparts a certain tanginess. Not having it is like substituting lime for kaffir lime leaves in Thai cooking. Okay, but definitely different. Lime in the absence of fresh lime, bottled lime or other citrus is a poor substitute. Bright fresh lime juice is critical in many Mexican dishes. Peppers, probably too many varieties to mention, but it's safe to say that most aren't in your local supermarket. But beyond the obvious ones like jalapeno and habanero, there are ancho, dried poblano, arbor and guajillo peppers, which are the holy trinity of Mexican peppers. Then there are the other pepper, dried variants, and smoked variants. Poblano, serrano, pasilla, cascabel, chipotle, among others. While you can substitute around, different chilies do have different profiles and will season your dish differently. This is the one thing I bring back from Mexico. They are readily available, cheap, and keep largely indefinitely. Mexican oregano. No, your oregano from the grocery store is not the same. Masa. I guess an important one would be masa, the flour that comes from nixtamalized maize. Really, so much of the cuisine is based around tortillas or gorditas or tamales or tostadas or just corn chips that it's hard to imagine a Mexican feast being complete without it. Your store-bought flour tortillas set you up for failure before you've even began. Cheeses. There are specific cheeses for specific uses. Queso fresco, Oaxaca, Chihuahua, Panela, Cotija, and Manchego all have their specific uses and applications. You see very few of them outside of Mexico, and they're difficult to substitute. Imagine making a pizza without mozzarella or a fondue without Gruyere, and you get a sense of the importance of the right cheese for the right job. While he's not Mexican, Rick Bayless is probably the US most well-known chef that specializes in Mexican cuisine, so he's an excellent spot to get started down the road. You really have no idea of the depth of Mexican food culture until you start exploring it. It's a shitload more than just tacos.